Welcome everyone. As I said, we're just letting everyone in through the waiting room. So if you can just bear with us a minute or two as that all comes together, we'll get started again. Good to see you again, Colin. One of these days I'm going to have to come out to that office and look at all those magnificent pictures you have behind you, Colin. So let's say just give us another 30 seconds as people come in, and then we will get cracking. The calm before the storm, Cassie. This is where it all starts.
Okay.
All right, so we'll there are still people coming through, but as most of you come along regularly, hear me say, we like to reward those who are on time. So we will get cracking and get stuck into today's webinar. And thank you all for joining us again this month. It's a great pleasure that I've got Cassie from our Brisbane office joining us today. So thank you very much, Cassie, for joining in. I know you had so much choice in the matter that you're very excited about it. But before we get stuck into today's topic, there's just a couple of things that I wanted to, at a general note, have a bit of a chat with everyone about. One of the things that we're hearing and seeing a lot, and most of you would be seeing it in the press, is the continual cycle of insolvencies hitting the front pages of the news. What's really interesting about that circumstance is that there's probably a false expectation that the world is blowing up with insolvencies. But the truth of the matter is that the numbers are still not at any type of record or significantly high levels. To give you a bit of an example, in actual fact, between May and June, there was a drop in insolvencies between the May and June months. So it's not quite as dramatic as people think. There is a little bit of growth from year on year, but if it's a 13% year on year growth in the last 12 months, but when you consider that last year we were still in a reserve holding pattern, that's not a great growth on year. The other thing that's really interesting is that we're seeing construction industry particularly being in the front pages all the time. An interesting fact though is that we are not actually, the construction industry is not anywhere near the numbers it was pre-pandemic. So if you think that you're seeing, a really big boom of insolvency, we're actually not there yet, and we're still on the way of that coming through. So an interesting stat I saw the other day showed if you looked at 5 years ago, if you looked at insolvencies per 10,000 companies, there were 50 insolvencies per 10,000 companies. In the last month, in the last financial year, we were actually really only sitting at about 30 companies per 10,000 that went into insolvency. So when you consider where we were 5 years ago and where we are now, we are still not at the peak or any major flow that people are talking about in the presses. So please be a little bit aware that I think we're still in the swell before the major storm. So when you're talking to clients, and when you look at inflation and interest rates and all that sort of thing, I think most of us know that there's still some pessimism to come, but we are finding that a lot of companies are holding on longer than we thought. And a lot of that is because they did have cash reserves coming out of COVID for this. One of the lead indicators, though, that came out of the Credit Watch survey earlier this week was that business-to-business trade defaults are up 52% on this time last year. And that is a real indicator of where insolvencies will go. So business-to-business transactions, we're seeing a lot more default now than where we were. And so therefore we think there is still stuff to come. So, I ad nauseum, I've talked about plan Bs on here and talked about making sure that your clients have some options for protection, even if they've still got the optimism today. And we're going to talk a little bit about that with Cassie, but having a look at how you can protect yourself against what may come is still really, really critical at the moment. Again, out of the Credit Watch survey, a couple of things that were really interesting is that construction is not the #1 high risk industry at the moment. unsurprisingly, it is cafes and restaurants and the hospitality industry. I think with the lack of spending in discretionary spending, we'll see those areas really struggle. One that did surprise me was transport, postal and warehousing as being the next most at-risk industry. So looking at your clients in that space, I can understand warehousing and I guess the impact therefore through to transport, because the demand's dropped off, so people aren't holding as much stock and they're not buying as much stock. So therefore, there's not as much need for warehousing. And then the third highest risk category at the moment is arts and recreation. And to be honest, I've got no clue what's in there. That could be all sorts of things. But anyway, just a bit of background. I just wanted to make sure that we're reading between the lines of the press, that it's not the end of the world that a lot of people think it is. Certainly the journos like to make sure that everyone thinks it's falling apart, but to be honest, I think we're still to see a lot more of that to come. So on to today's presentation, and to bring Cassie sitting there dying a slow death of having to be here, but she's well prepared for today. So welcome, Cassie. And as I mentioned before, Cassie is a strategist with our firm and based out of our Brisbane office. Cassie's been with us for about 3 years, I think it is now. And unlike some of our other strategists, didn't actually join us from an insolvency or a distressed business space area, did you?
No, I didn't come from the insolvency industry. My background's actually accounting and finance, having spent about 10 years as a business manager in the motor industry.
You would have plenty of fun. No wonder you and Hank get on so well. You're both in the car industry. So when we had a chat about what we were going to talk about today, it was a bit of a who's who of the horror stories, I guess. And it can be very frustrating for us to have clients come to us when it's almost too late. And in some cases, too late for us really to do anything significant to help them. Although we always say, it's never too late. There's less that we can do if we have less time. So, and I know all of us here at Jonge are very excited, very keen to make a difference to our clients. So today we're really going to drill down on a couple of cases, but really it's not about showing everyone listening what we're capable of, as much as I guess the message that you and we as a firm wanted to convey today is that it's not necessarily about looking at insolvency in the short term, but there is a need to look at it from a long-term perspective. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that's right. There are a lot of decisions that are made well before we get involved that have long-term impacts. And I guess I just really wanted to talk through that, because lately I'm seeing too many clients that are in a lot of trouble because of decisions they made years ago. Some of those back when they set up their initial structures.
Right. So, okay. So let's start with one that I know is still an ongoing matter at the moment. And I'll let you set the scene for the client, but I guess it's something that we're actually seeing quite a lot of at the moment, and the impact on, particularly in the micro and small business market, and the impact on families is something that's, if it's not set up right, it's a huge issue for us, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're seeing more of this. My recent client operated a small carpentry business, and with changes to super laws like many years ago, the company that he contracted to would no longer allow him to trade as a sole trader. So he needed a company or a trust structure to continue working with them. And rather than engaging a professional to set up the trust, his wife just jumped online and set it up herself. Not knowing the ins and outs of a trust, she set it up with an individual trustee. That was just her. So she thought, but we'll come back to that. As often is the case, he was a good carpenter, but when it came to the business side, he wasn't so good. Being inexperienced in running a business, the administration side of things was ignored, including activity statements and tax returns. In fact, the lodgements were nearly 10 years behind.
Okay, I'll just stop you there. 10 years is a long time. I'm seeing a lot of 2 to 3 years at the moment. And I'm not sure whether that's because of what we've been through in the last 2 or 3 years, or whether there's, I'm not even going to try and guess at all the 100 other reasons that come from them not doing it. But it is becoming a bit of a regular thing for us at the moment, seeing people trying to play catch up. So just on that point for our audience, if a client is coming back wanting to play catch up, what should they be looking at specifically?
Obviously, getting them done's a law, and playing catch up is important, but in most cases, it's going to crystallise the debt, which is then reported to the ATO, and then the ATO want their money. So depending on the structure, the debt may already be personal, or it will become personal under a lockdown DPN. So whether the client thinks they can pay it back or not, ensuring that there's a personal protection plan in place is key. I'd suggest that after drafting these activity statements or tax returns, you reach out to us prior to lodging these. And if there are things that can be done, we can help to protect them if they're addressed at the right time.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, is that timing of, we can't say don't do them, but come and talk to us when you're in the process, and that can make a real difference. But I know that we're going to talk about that a little bit further on. So, but thank you for that highlight now. So back to your client.
So I mentioned they were nearly 10 years behind, but finally decided to get on top of things. So with the help of a family member, they started doing the reconciliations and lodging the BAS. But then when they hit over 600,000, they realised that they might be over their heads. So that was when things with the client started with us.
Right. I can only imagine that the clients must have been petrified once they started seeing the numbers rise as they were getting through all of those returns. So, and I'm assuming they didn't have a spare 600,000 to play catch up on.
No, they didn't. They decided that they needed a new accountant, and they still had a few years of the activity statements to lodge plus the tax returns. And they had no idea how to handle the ATO with a debt like this. Their new accountant happened to be one of our referrers and introduced them to us.
Sometimes I think the tangled web that actually brings people to us is always quite interesting, isn't it? But I'm assuming then you met with the husband and wife, and how did things go in that conversation?
As you can imagine, they were pretty worried and they couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. So we sat down and went through everything. We talked about their personal position, and that as the individual trustee, the wife was going to be liable for this debt. Then we started looking at personal insolvency strategies for her. At the end of the meeting, we requested a number of documents to assist us in further developing the strategy, and which included the trustee. And I was kind of hoping that it might have had a corporate trustee.
I bet you're secretly really wishing for that one, because that completely changes the way we can look at a strategy, doesn't it? It's even if you look at it from just a purely an asset protection point of view, having a corporate trustee makes such a difference in how we go about things. But to be honest, I assume, I'm guessing that you didn't have a corporate trustee, otherwise it wouldn't be much of a story for us today.
No, unfortunately not. In fact, when we got the trust documents, things got a lot worse. We found out that not only was the wife the individual trustee, but her two sons were also trustees. It's common that with a trust, the family members would be beneficiaries, but not trustees. So the wife was a bit confused and thought she'd made them beneficiaries, not trustees. So as you can imagine, the next calls to our client were pretty tough, having to tell them that both the sons were also personally liable for the huge ATO debt.
Actually, that would not have been a good call. And I'm guessing that the trust and trustee structure that the wife put together of her own bat had no clue that it was going to be so wrong, but the impact was obviously horrible for her.
Well, it definitely wasn't her intention to make the sons the trustees, but this is a perfect example of why business owners need to seek professional advice when they're setting up their structures. But I'm preaching to the choir with this audience.
We are.
When we discovered this, we reviewed the personal asset position of the two sons and included them in our scope. But the really sad thing was that one of the sons had recently got married and settled on his first home and just had a newborn baby girl.
Oh, my Lord. And I'm guessing that it wasn't a very enjoyable family dinner when they had to discuss all of this. So I would say, in case anyone's not sure, when we're talking about multiple trustees, like in this situation, as it's unfortunately turned out, all the trustees have got a joint and several liability to, particularly to the ATO debt, but any debts of the trust. And with that joint and several means that, if you're looking at the ATO, particularly as in this case, it means that all three can be attacked for the full amount of the debt, it's not split three ways. But again, I'm probably talking to the already converted on that one.
Yeah, that's right. They're all going to be liable for the whole debt. And in this case, the lodgements had been made and the ATO had started taking action and actually issued the son with a statement of claim. So given that it had gone legal, we had to change our focus again.
So this has certainly had some twists and turns in the process so far. Where are things at the moment?
Well, it's far from over. And in this case, we needed a number of professionals and not just us. So as you well know, when needed, we'll bring in the appropriate experts to help bring the strategy together. So at this stage, we have the accountant doing some work to ensure all those lodgements are accurate, given that they had a family member completing these and they weren't an accountant or a bookkeeper. We've also got a lawyer looking at the statement of claim and working through some options in regards to the setup of the trust in the first place. And at the same time, we're continuing to work on a few asset protection strategies and prepare the two sons and the wife for bankruptcy if we can't sort through some other options to try and mitigate the situation.
Okay, so not really a good news story at this stage, but in fairness, without your involvement, there's a fair chance the son may well already have been in bankruptcy, and without it being in a controlled manner, there's a fair chance he would have already lost his house that he just moved his new wife and the new baby girl into.
Yeah, it is very possible. Obviously, the situation's far from over, but we've got a number of experts working through it to help us find the best way forward for these clients.
So, Cassie, this, normally when we're talking about our case studies, where, I get people, I get the other strategists on here and we talk through case studies to show people the good things that we can do. And that's not really what we're doing here. And to be honest, we like to leave on the back of a case study, we leave our audiences in awe of the magnificence of the things that we can do. Why did you want to tell this story? Why was this one important to you?
I wanted to bring it up because I'm just seeing more cases like this, and it highlights a number of things that I think are critical. So firstly, it's just a reminder to check important details, including who's the trustee and the beneficiaries of the client's trust. I can't tell you how many times I've reviewed documents and the situation is completely different to what the client thinks it is. There's also a lot of movement of clients at the moment, so it's important to review these critical information as part of the onboarding process when bringing on new clients.
Yeah.
And secondly, as I mentioned before, we're seeing a lot more clients that are playing catch up at the moment. So if you do have clients that are playing catch up, talk to us, preferably before the lodgements. There are options for clients in this situation, and if we have even a little bit more time, things can be done. And thirdly, as we've discussed before, we're not a one-stop shop, but we should be the first stop. We can bring together all the necessary experts so we can get a head start on these tricky situations.
And I guess, if you look at this story, if we'd known about the trust a bit earlier, then there might have been some things we could do before lodgements occurred.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is no one's fault because the client hadn't gone to anyone before that. And we're certainly not here trying to say that advisors are doing the wrong thing, because this movement of clients, which we're seeing a huge amount of, is an opportunity to check. I remember, have to be going back maybe 12 years, Cassie. I had a client when you were still probably in nappies. That came to us and the guy needed to go bankrupt, and he swore to me black and blue that he didn't own a house, that the house was in the wife's name and the wife's name only. When we did a title search, we found out that it was in joint names, and if we'd just gone off his word, he could have potentially lost his house when he went into bankruptcy. So it staggers me every day how few clients actually understand their business structures and all the rest of it. So it's a really good reminder for everyone that don't trust their clients to know exactly what their structures are. It's really quite scary, particularly if you're bringing on new clients. As I say, there is a huge movement of it. I think the other thing that's interesting is in Australia, it's a really low barrier for entry to be a director. You need a license to own. I've got a turtle that my daughter owns. We had to get a license to have a reptile. but you don't need to do anything to become a director, really. So, you're going to be a really good trader, you're a specialist in any field, and all of a sudden you're a business owner. And I know it's, and I've spoken to many referrers about the fact that how frustrating it is that we've got clients that don't understand the business side of the world. So this is not, we're not trying to say anything against the people listening. It's about just giving some ideas. So, Cassie, another point that you wanted to really talk about was DPNs, and probably more specifically about the impact of the ATO's big run on DPNs that occurred last year as they came out of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, this is just more of an awareness discussion than anything. As our listeners would know, the ATO went on an unprecedented run of issuing DPNs last year and in the early parts of this year. And pre-COVID, that type of activity would normally have driven huge amounts of insolvency as directors tried to avoid that personal liability. But this time we saw huge optimism, with directors thinking that they could find a way to pay these debts back in a reasonable time frame.
But Cassie, it's so true. I mean, I think in all my years, I've never seen the optimism that came with the DPNs this time. Normally, any DPN would just drag someone to insolvency within seconds, and we just didn't see any of that at all. Payment plans were being set up with all sorts of generous terms and generous processes. So what are you seeing as the impact of that now?
So what's happening is that we're starting to get calls from people who thought it would be okay. Their turnover and profits haven't returned to the levels that they'd hoped, which is resulting in them defaulting on these payment plans. Those defaults are in turn leading to the ATO to make claims personally. We'll start to see this in the next tax year, that refunds personally will get eaten up by the ATO for company debt as they've let these DPNs expire. Some of the calls are from clients that we prepared strategies for but hadn't engaged our services, that are now looking to press a button on these. And we're also seeing the ATO take aggressive action against those who ignore their debts. So I've had 2 potential clients recently that were issued with statements of claim from the ATO for their expired DPNs.
So I'm assuming our advice last year probably doesn't hold up, and we've got to restart things with these people.
Yes and no. Some of the corporate plans might change because of the expired DPNs that are now in play, and we might need to look at a more robust personal plan, but there are things that can be done. You talk a lot about having a plan B. So I guess I'm trying to show that any client of those who are listening who's got expired DPNs, who are making payments, should ensure they have a plan B in place, because there are many factors that are outside their control. And if they may have every intention of repaying this debt, but if they default on those payment plans because they had 1 week of reduced cash flow, the ATO might take action, and then that decision's taken out of their hands. So it could just be a personal asset protection plan, or it could be a larger corporate plan that needs to be enacted.
That's really good advice, Cassie. Thank you.
I'm just a little bit frustrated when clients come to us when we could have done so much more for them. So the sooner the better.
So I know, and it's but to be fair, I know that a lot of advisors listening are just as frustrated. They would love to have us get involved much sooner than we are, which is why we're talking about this today. Hopefully that we, with some of these stories, it'll actually give some extra ammunition to help the people listening, everyone listening today, who are talking with clients who've got that "it'll be fine" attitude. It will actually give them some more stories that they can use to get them to come and talk. So, Cassie, if we're going to discuss. If we're going to discuss things that advisors can do and what our listeners can do when they're setting up, particularly if we're looking at payment plans, we talked, you mentioned before about coming to talk to us when you're setting up the payment plans or catching up on the back work. If the client doesn't want to talk to us, what can the advisors do just to try and help the situation in case it gets worse?
The first thing that they they can do is check the addresses. So if the ATO are going to issue a DPN, they only need to post it to the director's address that's registered with ASIC. So their home address is required on that portal of information. If you're going to help them enter a payment plan, check the address at the same time, because if something goes wrong in the future, at least they'll get notice. I know it appears on the portal, but unless people are checking this a couple of times a week, they're probably going to miss it. The other thing I would do is actually work out what the core debt is versus the total debt.
So the core debt versus personal total debt, that's can I just get you to expand on that one a little bit?
Yeah, so under a DPN, the ATO can only issue on the core debt and not the interest and penalties. So in some cases, they may be paying twice the core debt, which means they're not always getting through the personal debt as quickly as they think they are. I've got an example of how to use this. So I had a client whose total debt was about 450,000, but the core debt was only 275 odd. So the client couldn't go bankrupt, and he'd let the DPN expire and was just trying to chip away at the debt through the company. Like many in this situation, he was fighting to pay this and was put under pressure with the cash flow of the business.
Right, I've certainly heard of this story a lot. We're seeing a lot of that, people coming in with that type of situation. So please go on. I'm interested to see what you did.
So he was sent to us to look at a plan B, and we had a look at his situation. Interestingly, a good option can be to complete a restructure, knowing that the client will be on the hook for the DPN, but only that core debt. So by liquidating the company, we knew the ATO would put the debt on him personally, but at that reduced amount, and that was going to be more affordable for him. So strategically, the restructure and liquidation actually made it easier for him to achieve those payments and to protect him personally.
That's smart. Well done. So I think, and that's a really interesting thing, is that I've often talked on here, and when people have met up with me personally, about how you can use insolvency as a tool. Obviously your client, you really wanted to pay the debt and wanted to do the right thing, and on top of that couldn't go bankrupt. But it was much easier for him to do it if he didn't have all the interest and penalties, which sometimes you can get remitted and other times you can't, but you've got to pay it all back first. Yeah, so a really good plan. I found that really interesting. Moving on, I guess, a little bit from there, are there any other areas that you'd like to mention that potentially can help advisors in the area that we're talking about today?
I know this next one is one that you all know, but business clients still struggle with it. When setting up payment plans, use this as an opportunity to make sure that they understand the difference between cash flow and profit. I know it's tough one, but when I'm talking to my referrers, we talk about this a lot. In the current economic environment, businesses are struggling, and we all know cash is king, but not at the expense of profit. So I believe that when setting up these plans, it can be the perfect opportunity to talk about where the money's coming from, and the fact that all of these repayments under the plan will have to come from the profits. And I say this for two reasons. One being that I hope that it can help you to explain why it's going to be so hard to maintain this for the long term, which is going to be needed. And two, it may just help you to get them talking to us, whether to ensure that they're protected with a plan B, or we might just have to come up with a more aggressive plan for the future.
Cassie, it's a bit like the example you mentioned before, isn't it? You talk about a more aggressive approach that some people would see using liquidation as a tool to pay a debt back at a slightly lower level as an aggressive approach, but it can certainly make things easier for a client, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's it.
So, and it's really, I think, and I guess if there's a message that I'd like to make sure that everyone's hearing, is that it can be a really good tool to help people. I'm working with one of the other strategists at the moment on a client where in the company they've got about a $5 million debt. Good turnover in the business, and this is the ATO debt. Good turnover in the business, and they're trying to make payments against the ATO. Certainly got hit by COVID, but a few other issues caused the grief. All of that $5 million we know will become a lockdown director penalty notice. So if he doesn't pay it back out of the company, he will have to go bankrupt. So we're looking at doing a restructure for him, but the whole concept of bankruptcy is just so far beyond him at the moment that we're working through restructuring the business in case the cash flow doesn't come back to do it.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean that we need to liquidate, because if the cash flow stays strong, he's probably going to pay the whole lot back. And again, I've said this before, as an Australian taxpayer, I'm very excited for him to pay it all back. But if he can't, there's 150 staff that would be put out if we don't have a structure to try and protect him against it if things don't turn out the way we want. So it is, it's really important to understand that it doesn't have to be a last result. You know, there's a lot of press at the moment about businesses needing to restructure and use different tools to get through. And this is a real good opportunity for people to do that. So Cassie, we've sort of come to the end of a lot of the really key things that we wanted to talk about today. So, and you've had some really interesting insights, a bit different to what we normally talk about, and not full of joys and rainbows and skittles like I try and keep it. But it's, you know, again, this isn't a bash on advisors. If anything, we're just trying to give you some extra tools or things to be aware of. As you've got you know, as I say, the optimism of a director is still quite high, even though I think the sentiment of directors is pretty scary. They're scared of what's going to come, but they're optimistic that they're going to find a way. So before I start to wrap things up and open for questions, and I think if people can either just put your name in the chat box, and then I can unmute you. Or you can ask the question in the chat box and then we can work through some of those questions. Is there anything you'd like to say before I go into my wrap-up mode and question mode and things like that, Cassie?
Just don't hesitate to reach out to us, even if you do think it's too late.
Good, nice, simple answer.
Yeah.
So I think for those who have known me for a long time, they've probably heard me say this before, but I know that we've got a few people on here that don't. I haven't had a chance to meet personally. I often use the example, and most people have heard of the book of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and written by Stephen Covey. And one of his 7 habits is always start with the end in mind. Now, most people, when they read that, they think about the good, positive end. You know, so when my business is 5 times the size and I want to sell it and I want to get out, this is how it's going to be, and I'm structured for all of that. What I think all of us should be looking for at the moment is what happens if that end is going down the other path. Mm-hmm. Have a think about what that looks like, and you know, don't be afraid to reach out to Cassie or any of the team and talk about the negative side, because that negative side can be protected quite well as long as you've got time to look at it. So there's some really interesting tricks is the wrong word, but it's the one that comes to mind at the moment. So there's a number of interesting things that we can do to protect people, and getting in early to do that is really, really important. If you have clients that are in that optimistic phase that are not willing to accept that there's a problem, can you believe this, Cassie? For the first time in about 4 months, I'm seeing sun. So I've got this, I'm trying to dodge this thing in the middle of my screen as I'm talking. So I apologise for everyone as I'm moving around. So just, you know, jump in, come pick up the phone, have a chat to us about these scenarios. We're more than happy to have a chat to people without it being anything that charges them money, because we'll have a look at the scenario. And as Cassie said, people who called us last year are now calling us back. If they'd taken on some of the advice from last year, the situations would be better than what they are. And I know that that's part of the frustration that, you know, Cassie, as a caring person, is that, you know, she wants to get the best result for everyone. So we're a nice short one again today, but I think we've sort of got everything across that we wanted to. Open the door for any questions if there are any. No one's putting anything up on the screen, so you've obviously just answered everyone's questions as you went, Cassie.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, and I think you've done a great job. Thank you very much for coming on today. Just as a heads up for people, we do our seminar series is starting to be put together now. I think over a rolling month from about the end of August through to September, we will be catching up with everyone in person. I'm trying to stay away from this line of sun. Can you believe that there's actually sun in Melbourne? So keep an eye out for some of our mail outs with those coming up. We have quite an extended sites this year. We're sort of now that everyone's happy to be back out and meeting in person, we've increased our venues, so we're looking forward to catching up with everyone there. We will be back this time next month with another webinar. I think we've got another one of our Brisbane strategists coming along, another hugely excited person to come online. Very, very smart people, but they don't like talking out online. So I'm excited about that. Doesn't look like we've got any questions today at all, Cassie. So I'll get the hopefully Jazz is in the background and she'll put up the poll for you all. Be nice, say nice things about Cassie. She's a good girl.
Huge fear of public speaking. So.
Oh yes. Well, I think when I started doing any type of public speaking, someone said to me that people are more scared of public speaking than they are of death, which means that you'd rather be shot than actually get up on stage, which I think is quite amazing. So
I do understand that.
So congratulations, you didn't need to die today, so, and you got through it. So thank you, Cassie. I really do appreciate it, because I know it is hard for a lot of people to do that. So and thank you, Claudia, for saying nice things. So that's it for us today, guys. Thank you very much for joining us. If you do have any questions, please don't be afraid to jump on the phone, call through to us, and we can talk about anything specific that you have in mind. Otherwise, I look forward to either seeing you in person or online next month. And again, thank you, Cassie, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
See you later.